Hey everybody, I'm Jack Rita with Future Pastimes, and I am a designer on expansions for the classic Dune board game 2019 edition from Gale Force 9. In this video, I will explain how to play Dune and cover the important nuances so that you can dive into the full advanced rules and enjoy the most thematic game ever designed. Now, each player in Dune has a different faction that they are in charge of, and they're trying to control 3 strongholds on the board by the end of a game turn in order to win. Factions have unique advantages, many of which bend or outright break the rules, so I'm going to cover the general rules first. Now, the first thing we're going to do is a quick overview of the board. We have here a map of Arrakis based directly on the one from the book. To win the game, you must have at least 1 force token in at least 3 of the 5 strongholds here: Arrakeen, Carthag, Sietch Tabr, Habanya Sietch, and Tuic Sietch. There are 3 other types of terrains on the board. Most are sand territories with a single border. The rock territories have double borders, and your forces there are not destroyed by the Coriolis storm. The strongholds have triple borders, and they are also safe from the storm. Finally, there is the Polar Sink territory in the center of the board. It is safe from the storm and from worms, and this is the only territory where you can have 2 or more factions coexisting without battling. There's never battles in the Polar Sink. Notice that the board has 2 types of spaces. The board is evenly divided into 18 sectors with these wedge shapes. This is for tracking where the storm is and what parts of the board are affected by it. The storm moves counterclockwise each turn a number of sectors, and spice or forces in sand territories are destroyed by the storm when it covers that sector, including when it moves over them. No forces may ship or move into or out of a sector that is covered by the storm. Territories are irregularly shaped and may span several sectors. More on that later. We have a turn tracker that starts on turn 1. Now, Dune can end on any turn from 1 to 10, but will most likely go somewhere in the middle. The phase track along the top shows which phase you are on. At the bottom of the board, we have the Tleilaxu tanks, where you will put forces and leaders that are killed in battle, and they will slowly return to your reserves over the course of the game. Finally, we have the Spice Bank, where spice is kept when it's not being used by players or placed on the map. At the start of the game, players will draw Traitor Cards. Each faction has 5 leaders, and each leader has a corresponding Traitor Card. Players draw the 4 cards, secretly choosing 1 to keep. If you ever oppose that leader in a battle, you may reveal the card and automatically win. More on that later. Now, you can always choose to keep one of your own leaders if dealt one, so that you have a safe leader, but that really only matters if the Tleilaxu faction are in the game. Otherwise, make a note about which leaders you didn't choose, your own or others, since that is valuable information, and somebody may pay you spice for that information at some point in the game. Let's quickly touch on the different phases, many of which are relatively short. The first phase is Storm. If the Fremen are in the game in advance, they will draw a random Storm card that shows 1 to 6 sectors. The Storm is moved that many sectors. With no Fremen in the game, 2 players will use battle wheels and dial 1, 2, or 3 on each wheel. And this is also true in Basic. The sum of both dials is how far the storm moves counterclockwise. The location of the storm will determine player order each turn. Players have their faction markers on circles around the edge of the board as evenly spread out as possible. The marker that the storm would get to next when it next moves is the first player, and play proceeds from there counterclockwise, or what we call storm order. If the storm covers your faction marker, then you are last in storm order. The next phase is the Spice Blow and Nexus phase. Draw a spice card and place the indicated amount of spice into the indicated territory unless it is covered by the storm. In advanced rules, you will do this twice, and you will keep 2 separate Spice Blow discard piles. If you draw a Sandworm after turn 1, it will devour spice and forces in the top territory of that discard pile. Then draw again until you have a territory with spice. Again, this is done for both discard piles because in advanced rules, you have 2 spice blows per turn since spice is more important and necessary. Any sandworms drawn on turn 1 are ignored and shuffled back into the deck. Now, when a sandworm is drawn after you have drawn the appropriate territory card for that discard pile, there is a Nexus. This is when alliances can be formed, or if there are alliances already, they can be broken, and new ones can be formed. And you can maintain the same ones as well. More on alliances later, just know that this is when those occur. Chome Charity is the next phase. In this phase, any faction with fewer than 2 spice gains spice from the bank until they have 2. So 1 if you have 1, 2 if you have none. Next is the bidding phase. This is one of the longer phases in the game. Players will bid spice to buy treachery cards without really knowing what they're buying. Everyone starts the game with a certain amount of spice, and they start with 1 treachery card, and everyone has a hand limit of 4 cards. I'll cover how bidding works, and then I'll touch on what's in the treachery deck itself. For each player who starts this phase with a hand that is not full, 1 treachery card will be put up for auction. So draw that many cards and make a pile next to the deck. Then, one at a time, a card will be placed up for auction, remaining face down. Starting with the first player in storm order, players may bid spice or pass. If bidding, you must bid more than the previous bid, but you may not bid more spice than you actually have. If you pass, you are not automatically out of the bid on that particular card, but you can jump back in if the bid comes back around to you. Once all other players have passed, the last bidder wins the card and pays the spice to the bank. If your hand is full, you may not bid on any more cards. Now, the only treachery cards you can play from your hand during bidding, and therefore make space in your hand in order to re-enter the bidding, are Truth Trance and Tleilaxu Gola. You cannot, therefore, play Karama card, which, among other things, lets you win a card without having to pay any spice for it. Once a card is sold, the next player in storm order will open the bidding on the next card, and so forth. If all players pass on a card, the bidding ends immediately, and those cards that were unsold are placed back on top of the deck in the same order. So, what's in the treachery deck itself? Well, this is where you will get weapons and defenses which you can use in battles. There are also special cards that have one-shot effects, like those that I mentioned previously, Truth Trance, Gola. And finally, there are worthless cards that literally say worthless on them. They have no effects, but they do take up space in your hand. And the only way you can discard those cards is in battles. More on that later as well. The mix of cards for the base game is 17 cards out of 33 are weapons or defenses. 5 are worthless, and the remaining 11 are special cards. That ratio is roughly the same when adding in the 14 cards from the Ixians and Tleilaxu expansion, though many of the weapons and defenses from that expansion are better than those in the base game. The next phase is Revival. This is when players get to return some of their lost forces from the Tleilaxu tanks. Each turn, players can revive up to a total of 3 forces. Each faction gets a certain number of those forces for free, but after that, each force costs 2 spice to revive. Every faction has 5 leader discs that are used in battles as well. These can be killed by the weapon treachery cards, and when that happens, they go to the tanks. But a faction cannot revive any of their dead leaders until all of them are in the tanks. Then they can revive 1 each turn. The cost for leader is its printed battle strength, so Dr. Yui only costs 1 spice to revive, but Stilgar costs 7. Next is the shipping and movement phase. In Storm Order, each player may make 1 shipping action. Then they may make 1 movement action, and it's all on the same turn. So you ship, and then you move, and then the next player does so. You're not required to do either, and you do not have to move the forces that you shipped. The cost to ship forces to the board is 1 spice per force if you are shipping directly to one of the 5 strongholds. It costs 2 spice per force to ship to any other territory. You cannot ship or move into a sector that is under storm. Each stronghold can only have 2 factions in it, so you cannot ship or move into a stronghold that has 2 other factions already present. There is no limit to any of the other territories. When moving, you may move any or all of your forces in a territory to another territory. The base movement is 1 territory. Note that many territories are composed of multiple sectors, and you can move or ship to any sector of a territory. But you must specify which sector your forces are in at the end of the movement or shipping. And if you wish to collect spice in a sand territory, your forces must be in the same sector as the spice. If, when a faction starts their movement action, they have any forces in Arakeen or Carthag, their movement rate is 3 territories. You have access to ornithopters for that action. And it can be any of your forces on the board, not necessarily those in Arakeen or Carthag. It is not uncommon for a player to ship 1 force into one of those cities just so that they have 3 territory movement for other forces on the board. And this increased movement is one of the reasons why these 2 cities are more valuable to control throughout the game. So how does a faction win on turn 1? Well, if they start the game with forces already in a stronghold, which some factions do, a faction could potentially ship into Carthag or Arakeen, and then with the 3 territory movement, get into Siege Tabor, for example. Also bear in mind that there is a treachery card called Hajar, which gives you 2 movement actions. This too could put a faction into 3 strongholds on turn 1. In the battle phase, if 2 or more factions are in the same territory, other than the polar sink, they must battle. Battles occur in storm order. If a player is in multiple battles, the first player in storm order, known as the aggressor, chooses the order of the battles that they are in. And if a battle ends in a tie, it is also broken in storm order, with the aggressor winning the tie. Now, being the aggressor has nothing to do with who moved into an occupied territory last or who is attacking whom. It is purely determined by storm order. Each player in a battle must make a battle plan using the battle wheels. Each battle plan can be composed of 4 elements, and it must include a leader if possible. It can also include force strength, a weapon, and a defense. Now, you must use a leader if you have either a leader disc or the treachery card called Cheap Hero. If you don't, you must say so and cannot play any treachery cards. The winner of a battle will be the player with the highest total of leader strength and force strength. The battle wheel has a dial for determining force strength. In basic Dune, it is just the number of your forces in that territory that you are willing to sacrifice. Those forces will go to the Tleilaxu tanks if you win. And if you lose, all of your forces will go to the tanks. Now, in advanced rules, the forces only count half a point each, but you can spend spice to count them another half a point. You cannot, though, spend more spice than you have forces in the territory. So if you have 5 forces present, the highest you can dial without spice is 2.5, but you would lose all 5 forces. Let's say you want to have at least 1 force in the stronghold at the end of a battle if you win. You could dial a 2 for the 4 forces you are sacrificing. If you spend up to 4 spice, you can increase the dial by 0.5 for each spice. With 4 spice, your dial is 4 strength. That plus the value of your leader is your battle strength. The wild card in battles is weapons and defenses. In general, they fall into 2 categories: projectile weapons and defenses, and poison weapons and defenses. You can play 1 weapon and 1 defense. When battle plans are revealed, you see whose weapons are stopped by a defense. If not, the leader disc is killed, and that value of that leader is no longer counting towards your battle strength. Of course, there are some special weapons, especially in the Ixians and Tleilaxu expansion. And there's no defense against the laser gun, for example. Although if any player in a battle reveals a laser gun, and any player in the battle reveals a shield, it causes an atomic explosion, killing both leaders and all forces. So watch out for that. The loser of the battle must discard all treachery cards used in their battle plan, and all of their forces in the territory will go to the tanks. They don't automatically lose their leader, however. That only happens if their opponent used a weapon and there was no defense against it. A surviving leader is considered to still be in the territory where that battle took place for the rest of that turn and cannot be used in another battle taking place in a different territory. However, it could be used in a second battle that is in the same territory. Let's say, for instance, you're in a territory with two other factions fighting over spice. You could use that same leader twice. If you win the battle, you may keep any treachery cards that were not one use only. You also collect spice for all leaders killed in that battle, even your own. Spice in the amount of the leader's battle strength is collected from the spice bank. Note that if you have any worthless cards in your hand, the only way that you can get rid of them is to play them in your battle plan in lieu of a weapon and/or a defense. If your opponent uses a leader that matches a traitor card that you hold, you may immediately reveal that card, calling out traitor, and you win the battle. You do not lose any of your forces or spice that you are spending. You do not have to discard any of your treachery cards, even the one-shot ones, and your leader can be used in a different battle in the same turn. Your opponent, on the other hand, loses everything. They lose the spice that they spent, all of their forces, all of their treachery cards, and their leader goes to the tanks, with you collecting spice for its strength from the spice bank. The next phase is spice collection. Any faction with forces in a territory containing spice will gain 2 spice per force collected from that territory. If that player has forces in Arakeen or Carthag, the rate increases to 3 spice per force because you have access to carry-alls. In the advanced rules, if you have forces in Arakeen or Carthag, you also collect 2 spice in taxes from the bank, and anyone controlling 2x each collects 1 spice. Again, these are strongholds that are a little more valuable to control for these and several other reasons. Finally, we have the last phase, the Mentat Pause. By and large, this is just a check to see if anyone has won the game. But if you have made deals with other players that involved spice bribes, it is collected in this phase and not when the bribe is made. This prevents players from gaming the system and showing charity, among other things. Mentat Pause also affects other things from expansions. Let's touch on faction advantages, and then we'll talk about alliances. Each faction has several unique things that it can do that the other factions can't. I won't cover them all, but I'll give you a sense of how it affects the game. The Emperor faction, for example, they gain all the spice that other factions pay when bidding for treachery cards, rather than having that spice go to the spice bank. Only the Emperor himself pays the bank. The Atreides faction gets to peek at each card up for auction, and they get to also see one of the 4 elements of an opponent's battle plan: weapon, defense, leader, number dialed. The Harkonnen have an 8-card hand limit, and they gain 1 treachery card for free whenever they buy one. The Bene Gesserit faction may use the voice to compel their opponent in a battle to use or not use a type of weapon or defense, like a poison weapon, among other things. Now, when players are in an alliance, they may pay for some or all of their allies' treachery cards, pay for some or all of their allies' shipments, but they may not pay for revivals, and they cannot just share spice freely, nor bribe their ally. Each faction also has 1 or more advantages that they can use on their allies' behalf. For example, Atreides can let their ally see one part of their opponent's battle plan, as if it were the Atreides themselves. Similarly, the Bene Gesserit can use the voice on their ally's opponent. Factions and alliance need 4 strongholds between them to win, so it could be 2 and 2, 4 and 0, however you want. And that is all you really need to know to get started with Dune. Of course, keep the rulebook handy, and somebody should definitely read it. New players tend to fare better with factions like Emperor and possibly Atreides because of the card knowledge. I tend to replace Bene Gesserit with Tleilaxu when I have a new player because the Bene Gesserit have a lot of nuances with their advisors in the advanced rules. Chom is also a pretty easy faction to play, but I do recommend not having too many of the economic factions in the game all at once. 3 factions that are economic at the most, and frankly, 2 is probably better when you have newer players. Spice is critical in Advanced Dune because you need the spice to pay for your cards, pay for your shipments, pay for revivals, and for spice styling in battles. Therefore, going after spice on the board is especially critical if you are not one of the economic factions. So, that's all you really need to know to get started. Good luck, and long live the fighters.